Hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming out, even though despite the rain and missing that. Amazing venue, amazing room, but also just an amazing building. If I'd have told the 14-year-old me that I'd be doing a presentation at the Science Museum one day, it would have blown my tiny mind. Really genuinely inspiring place, which as a young boy did inspire me for a lifetime interest in science, to do a science degree, which I then dropped out of. Don't tell anyone that. But okay, so I'm going to talk today about, I like a pun in my titles, about our food systems. But first, a little bit about me. It's a picture of me from a few years ago. A bit more grey now, apparently. But yeah, I'm a chef. I mean, I used to work in restaurants and hotels and that sort of thing in London and in Manchester, and those sort of shouty, sort of 1990s shouting at each other sort of kitchen environments with lots of swearing and breaking up fights between kitchen porters and stuff. But then I moved to a career as a development chef for what at the time was the largest food manufacturer in the UK, and I imagine I probably developed some recipes that you guys have all eaten, hopefully, for various well-known brands. And then I'll explain a bit about the journey, actually, how this happened. But I started writing a blog called The Angry Chef, and that became quite popular. And I started doing then quite a lot of writing, having not written anything before about food science and health and sustainability and diet. I do less writing now, I do a little bit. Writing books is really hard work, but I now work in food innovation, using my culinary skills to make food healthier and more sustainable for various partners. And I work a lot between universities and large companies, helping bridge the gap between academia and industry to create a better food system. I have to point out at this stage, it's not a great thing to have to point out, I'm not a terrorist, because about 4 years ago, just before that book came out in paperback, actually, just 2 weeks before, a guy in America blew himself up in a suicide bombing, which is obviously tragic, but it was only him who died. Unfortunately, his name was Anthony Warner. Which really ruined Google searches for that book. I blame the slightly disappointing sales. Yeah, and some, I say this because if you Google me, sometimes there's some videos and there's some really strange comments underneath, which my daughter finds hilarious, saying, "Why is this guy talking about food systems?" Thinking I'm that guy. I also didn't play in goal for Liverpool in the 1990s. Okay, so I'm going to talk about, I was talking before, I said I moved from a kitchen. I don't know if people have worked in catering. I imagine a lot of you probably have. I moved from a sort of catering kitchen as head chef of lots of restaurants and hotel kitchens to a large corporate office for a large food manufacturer, and that was quite a difficult transition because I didn't quite realise lots of things you weren't supposed to say directly to people to their face, and you couldn't tell people how you felt about them. You just had to sort of subtly undermine them for years. But that meant I got in trouble with HR quite a lot, and I got sent on training courses, and they were sort of communication skills and conflict resolution and conflict management, and those sort of things. You can imagine the thing, and there I am, a sort of just out of industry chef, sat at the back, looking annoyed, and miserable, yeah, mostly they were pretty boring. But then one actually was quite sort of impactful and a little bit life-changing, and it involved this slide, which came in one of these presentations. You might have seen this slide before. I imagine some of you probably have. And it's about how we communicate with the world. It's about, and it says here that, if you can't see it, basically, in terms of the way we communicate with the world, the important things are sort of body language, words, and tone of voice. The words you say are actually quite unimportant, and tone of voice and body language are far more important, 55%, 38%, just 7% for words. So I'm sat there thinking, wow, this is amazing. This really changes lots of things about how you see the world. I find it really quite incredible, really almost unbelievable. And then I started to think, yeah, I think this is, I don't think I believe that. Let's just imagine, right? So let's say you're in a burning building, and you've got your phone, but the microphone's broken on your phone. There's two things you can do. You can phone Dave and say, Dave, the house is on fire, call the fire brigade or whatever. Or you can video call him and do an interpretive dance to explain what's going on. And according to this, that's going to be loads more effective doing the interpretive dance than actually the words. So I, obviously, in a conflict resolution and management course, had an argument with the trainer that I did not believe this slide. And I see this slide all over the place, and I don't believe it. And when I went away, I researched it, I found out, yeah, I was actually right. It's actually not true at all. And so when you see this, remember, there's a reference to it in a book called Silent Messages from the mid-70s. But that was like 2 pages, not published scientific research, just 2 pages in a book where he talks about an experiment he did in his lab, which has never been replicated, and it was on single, ambiguous words like hello or why. Any sort of complex communication, this doesn't apply at all. And actually the words you say are incredibly important. If you imagine the great speeches in history, if you know, Martin Luther King or Winston Churchill had instead done their famous speeches and just mumbled, but with the same body language and tone of voice, it wouldn't have meant anything. Words are incredibly important, far more important than 7%. Sure, it's good to have some body language and change your tone of voice, but just ignore that. The reason why this was quite life-changing for me, because I then went away and did quite a lot of thinking about other things in life where this thing people believe because it's got some numbers and it sounds a bit sciencey, but aren't actually true. And there were loads of them in food, there were loads of them in diet. And I started writing about that. I wrote a blog, which quickly became quite popular, and then eventually turned into 3 books, one on diets, sort of fad diets and that sort of thing. So, you know, low carb diets and coconut oil diets and all those sort of misunderstandings. One on obesity and one on sustainability. Mostly exploring these sort of areas where we get stuff wrong. And yeah, they you know, it proved quite popular. This one has been translated into, I think, 14 languages, everything apart from French. So, you know, if anyone can help me with that. They didn't want some sort of English chef telling them what to do, apparently. Yeah, but there's some quotes there, and they're mostly just showing off. I've been reviewed in Nature, so I spoke at the Science Museum, and I've been reviewed in Nature, which is not bad for a chef who dropped out of a biochemistry degree. So I've had lots of support from sort of dietitians and nutritionists and health professionals who work in this area and see all this misinformation and like to try and counter it. But the quote at the top is from Steve Pinker, who you might have heard of. He actually helped me with a couple of my books, who was really supportive. The reason I put that there is because I'm really interested in not just the science and understanding where these sort of scientific misunderstandings are, but in the psychology of what it is about food that makes us really prone to that sort of scientific misunderstanding and believing these sort of things. One of the reasons I think is explained quite well in this fairly obscure picture. We had a bit of trouble in the village I live, so I put a security camera on the side of my house, quite high up, looking over the side garden. And I was looking at the footage and I thought, who's that strange old bald man and what's he doing in my garden messing with my recycling bin? It took me quite a long time to realise that was actually me in there, because I'd lost, I had no idea at all. I'd just not seen myself from that angle before, which is terrible. And the reason I bring this up is because it's a bit rubbish getting old, and lots of people here will know that. But hangovers are so much worse than you can imagine. But you know, bits start to go wrong. Hair stops growing in one place and starts growing out your ears and nose. I can't get anything off a high shelf because of a problem with this shoulder. I can't hear much out of that ear anymore. It's rubbish getting old. Your body declines and your mind declines. There's no two ways about it. There are good things as well, but mostly it's just awful. And the reason I say this is because we all understand that. We all know that getting old is a bit rubbish. But what we tend to do as people is to confuse that decline we have in our bodies and mind with a general decline in the world. So if you ask someone like me, what was life like back in the 1980s? I'll probably say, oh, it was amazing. You know, kids could play out, streets were really safe, there was no crime, the food was, we just had home-cooked meals all the time. In reality, that's not true at all. You know, crime was far worse, diet was terrible. It's mostly sort of crispy pancakes and potato waffles. But we tend to idolise the past and think that things were better, in spite of the evidence that actually things now aren't too bad. I know everyone will say, oh, things are terrible now, but in reality, things are far better than they were. And this is an appeal to antiquity, essentially, and it's a common misunderstanding, a common sort of known psychological phenomenon that people tend to idolise the past in spite of the evidence. So in diets, there's a huge thing where people talk about the Paleolithic diet and how we should eat like we did in the Middle Paleolithic, which is genuinely a terrible idea. It really is. They lived till about 28, I think, and ate just like anything that was lying around on the floor, which is not a great thing to do. But then people, even more popular than that, so people say you should eat like your great-grandparents used to. My great-grandmother had a terrible diet, a genuinely awful diet. Most of her calories, about 92%, were from poor quality bread, which was probably adulterated with something. There was no cold supply chain, so she had very little fresh produce. Her diet was far worse, far less nutritionally adequate than ours is today. So this call for, you know, sort of living like we did in the past or eating like we did in the past is generally not based on any good evidence at all. An appeal to antiquity is incredibly common. It's incredibly powerful. It's used by populist politicians. Things were better back in the day. We should return to how things were in the past. Most major religions have some sort of story about a perfect world being ruined by humanity at the heart of them. And it is something that we need to really think about in food, and something that influences a lot of our thinking in food. In reality, this is what antiquity of our diets looks like. It looks like nutritional inadequacy. It looks like vitamin C deficiency and vitamin E and sort of scurvy and rickets and night blindness and all those horrible things. Hugely inadequate diets, huge misunderstandings about nutrition in the sort of up to the sort of late 19th century, and not really understanding what was causing these conditions. Our science and our progress in our food system has changed the world immensely for the better. And I'm going to explain how immensely for the better in a couple of graphs we've got here. These are, I know that they'll just be graphs and you can't really pick them out from here, but these graphs I think are some of the most extraordinary examples of scientific progress in humanity. This is cereal yields the dotted line is cereal yields. The solid line is food production per person between 1960 and 2015, and you can see food production per person, and bear in mind this is with an exponentially increasing population, pretty much doubles from 1960 to 2000 and goes up another 20% between 2000 and 2010. We produce far more food per person than we ever have. But also we've been far more efficient at producing food. This dotted line is yields per cereal yields per hectare. And that pretty much doubles over the same time period. We can go through twice as efficiently as we did just in 1960. And what's that done for the world? It's done some extraordinary things. This chart is deaths around the world from protein, energy, malnutrition. And bear in mind, again, this is an exponentially increasing human population in which this is occurring. We go from about 1980, a little bit after actually, 700,000 children died from protein, energy, malnutrition. And bear in mind, that is an absolutely horrendous death. I can't imagine anything worse, I genuinely can't imagine anything worse, as a parent, of seeing your child starve to death and not be able to feed them. From 700,000 in 1982 to less than, far too many still, but less than 100,000 today. That's an extraordinary decrease within my lifetime. I think this graph is even more extraordinary. This is the annual rate of people dying from famine per decade. And you can see 1860, 1870, goes on per decade up to the 1960s. These numbers are 50 per 100,000 people, per decade, 142 per 100,000, 82, 60.4. That's pretty much the same as a severe pandemic or a large global conflict, especially the larger ones there. And if we go back further in history, these won't go down. They'll be equally high. It's just hard to get good quality data. 1970 down to 8.4, sorry. And you can see from there, we've pretty much stopped these famine events, which kill this many people every year. For me, that is the most extraordinary example of progress that humans have ever made. Probably mankind's most pernicious and persistent enemy has pretty much, not entirely, but pretty much been defeated. When I was writing my the book over there, I spoke to a lot of people who lived behind the Iron Curtain and grew up behind there and experienced food shortage. Some of them actually had parents who had experienced the severe famines in Ukraine in the 1930s, and someone who in China in the 1960s, which killed tens of millions of people. But they had known what it's like to not have food and to be worried about being able to feed themselves the next day. And all of them said the same thing to me, which surprised me actually. They said one of the worst things about it was that the best people and the brightest people and the most intelligent people and the people who should have been doing politics and should have been doing science and should have been doing art and music, all of them spent all their effort and all their energy trying to make sure their families had enough to eat the following day. And for that reason, their societies failed to progress, because hungry societies don't develop vaccines, and they don't educate their children, and they don't fight for human rights, and they don't explore the cosmos, and they don't protect the environment, they don't do any of that. All of that happens when you have a food system, which means that people don't have to worry about eating tomorrow. And most of us don't have to worry about eating tomorrow, which is the first time in history that has ever really been the case for the majority of population. We've gone from about 1820, where 10% of people had enough food to eat, to today, when about 90% of the world's population has enough food to eat, again with the population going up. It's extraordinary progress, and it underlines all that other progress. No other scientific progress really occurs until you sort the food system out. It's the most important thing any society has to do. Here's some of the progress that I'm talking about. It's all underlined by food systems. Poverty, we go from 20% not living in extreme poverty to less than 10%. Basic education, only 17% have it in 1820. Today, there's about 14% don't. Literacy, same sort of increase. Democracy happens later, but is a huge amount of increase. Vaccination goes from none in 1950 to only 20% of people not vaccinated. Child mortality, and this is for me the most important one, because that's how you judge how well a society is doing, how well it protects the mortality of its children. In 1820, 43% of children died before 5. Today, 4%. That is extraordinary, and a huge amount of that progress is underpinned by progress to our food system. How does that happen? Well, yeah, there's lots of interesting stuff in the exhibition about some really high-tech stuff with fermentation and growing meat cells in the laboratory and growing animal fats in the laboratory. I'm less interested in that sort of thing, because I do believe that most of the food we eat will always be underpinned by farmers doing clever things in fields. And I also believe that if we're really going to make food that changes the world, it needs to be affordable, and needs to be available, and it needs to be desirable, which is where sort of people like me come in, trying to make ingredients, make food desirable as a development chef. But I want to talk about some of the simple solutions which have been hugely impactful. I'm going to go through these fairly quickly, but they're in the book. Plug. Okay. The other two are available on Amazon as well. So when I was a sort of young environmentalist in the 1980s, it was pretty much assumed that this area of Africa, the Sahara Desert, was advancing south, and that advance was unstoppable, and millions of people of here were going to be thrown into extreme poverty, and there's going to be mass migration and mass starvation. That was pretty much an ecological disaster people could see happening in real time. But it never really progressed as much as we were told it was going to. And the reason for that was not some huge international effort to change that area and put a huge amount of infrastructure and irrigation in place. It was just a simple change of farmer practices. There's a lot of farmers in Niger went south to do some seasonal work. They stayed a bit longer than they normally do. When they came back, there's a lot of sort of seed memory within the soil had grown more than it normally would. It was too difficult to clear. So they only cleared a smaller area than they would normally do, and they planted on what was left. But what they found was that sort of seed memory sort of trees and plants protected the crops they'd planted. And actually the crops did better that year and they got more yield in total than they would have done if they'd stripped the whole land. And that practice started to spread from farm to farm. And it was only really when people did a lot of sort of serious aerial photography of the area, they realised how extraordinary that spread had been. In Niger alone, there's 6 million hectares managed this way, producing 600,000 tonnes of food because it was simple, and it didn't cost the farmers, and it worked. It was just a change of farmer practices which really saved that region from it's still one of the hardest places in the world to live, but it really saved that region from an ecological disaster. This guy is M.S. Swaminathan. He's an Indian scientist, and he's one of the most important people in the development of our food system in the 20th century. He died recently, actually, but he must have saved millions and millions of people's lives. He transformed Indian agriculture. And when people will be aware, perhaps, or from the exhibition, of sort of work of Norman Borlaug and the Green Revolution, when Borlaug got to India, he had these really high-yielding wheat varieties. India at the time was having to import a lot of food aid every year. That was causing a lot of problems. And essentially, Borlaug said, here's this wheat, go for it, and you can save your agriculture. What he didn't realise was, within India, that wheat, the Mexican red wheat that Borlaug had developed, just wasn't popular in Indian cuisine. It just didn't work in the sort of breads people wanted to make. So it really failed to cut through an impact early on. And it took the work of this scientist and a number of his colleagues to develop new varieties through various quite sort of interesting and innovative techniques, including irradiation of seeds. But he eventually developed varieties which were short and responded to nitrogen fertilizer and also suited Indian cuisine. And that transformed Indian food production. And actually that transformation ended up driving much of India's subsequent economic development. Because as I said, if you don't sort the food out, then you won't sort out anything else. This is reckoned to be one of the most transformative medical treatments of the 20th century, has saved a huge number of people's lives. And it's salt, sugar and water, essentially as a treatment for diarrhea, developed in Bangladesh hospitals in the 1960s, really came to prominence in the India-Pakistan War of 71, I think, because there were lots of refugee camps and lots of children had diarrhea. At the time, medical scientists said, oh, well, you can't treat diarrhea orally, you have to have intravenous drips. It was kind of, there was a bit of protection that was the only way to treat diarrhea, but it's expensive and it was difficult and you often couldn't do it in certain environments. But developing this very, very simple, incredibly cheap way of rehydrating children was extraordinary. It reduces diarrhea mortality by 93%. I reckon it's saved far more than 70 million lives. You can see how diarrhea deaths go down from 1980 when it really started being implemented. 2.5 million children in 1980, 300,000 to 400,000 today, obviously far too many, horrendous death. But we have made extraordinary progress, largely due to that incredibly simple innovation. This is a ready-to-use therapeutic food, which is essentially a processed peanut paste with a complete nutrition solution. And it is used in the treatment of chronic malnutrition. It's a 4 to 8 week treatment. As I said, 90% recovery rate, 9 million children treated every year. The transformational thing about this is kind of now how we address famine relief, really. We used to send rice, we used to send wheat, we used to send grain. It's incredibly difficult to cook, incredibly difficult to process, incredibly difficult to transform into food. But if you send this, people can take it into their home, they can eat it without any implements, they can just, and the recovery rate for children is absolutely extraordinary. It's a huge and incredible innovation which has saved millions and millions and millions of lives. And I think we don't really celebrate it enough. It's been responsible for a huge amount of that decline in deaths from global famines because it transformed the way we treat them. Now, I've sat here and explained why I think the food system is amazing and why I think the food system is wonderful, but obviously there are problems. And I've written a huge amount about the problems facing our food system, but it's not perfect, but it is extraordinary and is, I think, the greatest innovation in history. But we have problems. I said there was only 10% of the population currently facing hunger, but that is 800 million people, probably more, and has slightly increased maybe in the past few years, which is reversing the normal trend. But also there are carbon emissions of agriculture. There's reports say that if we don't dramatically change the way we eat and consume food, which does involve switching from animal protein to plant protein in most countries, then the carbon emissions from agriculture alone will be enough to raise global temperatures by 2 degrees by 2050. So if everything else goes down to zero, which, spoiler, it won't, then agriculture will still cause that change and have a devastating impact. So it is not enough to change agriculture to stop climate change, but it is essential, and it is something we have to work on very hard. Water is another huge issue. Agriculture uses 70% of the world's water. Lots of the world is suffering water stress. Lots of cities don't have enough water at certain times of the year. We really need to dramatically change the way we manage water in our agriculture. We're using a lot of the world's food is currently driven by underground water being pumped up, which is fossil water, which gets replaced by seawater, so eventually can't be used. So it's something that's heading towards us really fast and something we really need to address. So obviously when we take land, we need land for agriculture, but when we take land for agriculture, we often end up farming it in a way that destroys the soil. Once you destroy soil on land, it cannot be replaced. The loss of soil is seen from many civilizations around the world. The Romans and the Greeks all mined the soil around where they lived and ended up destroying their civilizations. We're kind of doing that on a global scale. We need to manage our soil far better. And also, as we deforest land, we obviously destroy a lot of habitat, and agriculture has driven one of the biggest species extinctions in the history of the planet. It will be written into our fossil record for eternity, until the Earth burns up in the sun. I think one of the most terrifying statistics I have read is by 2050 again. People often look to this date. If we don't change the way we produce and consume food, all the tropical forests on Earth will have been destroyed. Every single one from Brazil and Central Africa and Asia. And that is something that we just cannot do. It just cannot happen. We have to change. Okay. But one thing that is true is we can feed 10 billion people sustainably. Actually, the population will probably rise by 2050, it'll be about 10 million, 2070, 80, it'll be 11 billion. It won't get much higher than that, it'll start to decline. If we can feed that many people sustainably, we can defeat hunger forever, which is almost unthinkable. It's absolutely extraordinary, but it is something that is within our grasp. But we're not doing it now. We must reduce consumption of animal protein. We must eat more plant protein. I'm not vegan. I do think meat and dairy have a part in our food landscape, but we have to dramatically reduce how much we're eating. And I also think, I'm not going to go into too much detail, maybe in the questions on ultra-processed foods. There is a narrative about ultra-processed foods at the moment, which is dominant in our food system. But people talking about that don't think about this protein transition because there is conflict between the two for various reasons. And so it's something that we need to talk about it more. Protein transition for me is the most important thing that we must address in the world of food. but we are not working to address that, and a lot of it's because this ultra-processed narrative has sort of taken over. But also people like me working on the protein transition don't talk about ultra-processed foods enough. We kind of dismiss it, but that's the landscape we live in. I think about Borlag changing the wheat in order to make it more suitable for consumers. We need to understand what consumers do in order to make them eat more plant protein. Has to be affordable, has to be available, has to be delicious, has to be desirable. And so it needs sort of people working in food to create better plant protein. And I say chefs can save the world. There's a couple of quotes which follow me around. This one I don't like. It's by Michael Pollan. People who have seen it. Don't eat anything your great-grandmother wouldn't recognise as food. Well, I explain. My great-grandmother had a terrible diet. Don't eat anything with more than 5 ingredients. Like, what delicious thing doesn't have more than 5 ingredients? I mean, that's just terrible advice. Or ingredients you can't pronounce. Well, there's lots of things around various cuisines that I can't pronounce. I don't like any of those rules. It was kind of in a desire to make some rules around eating, which I just didn't agree with. I much prefer this quote. This sums up how I think about food. It says, the way globalization occurs, this is from Hans Rosling, whose organisation was behind a lot of the graphs I showed you today. The way globalization is occurring could be much better. And it's true, our food system could be much better. I don't deny that. But it is extraordinary, and the worst thing is not being part of it. It's only when you speak to people who aren't part of this global, connected and plentiful food system that you realise how terrible it would be to live without it. Thank you very much. I've been the Angry Chef.
Thank you so much, Anthony, for a stimulating talk. Really great to hear some of your views. As Lillian said, I'm heading up the Global Nutrition and Health Science team at Tate Lyle, and it's my pleasure tonight to talk a little bit more about nutrition. But before I do that, I just need to take stock and talk about Tate Lyle. Somebody's already said it to me this evening. Oh, I've been to your plant where they do the sugar refinery. Actually, Tate Lyle sold the sugar business about 16 years ago. It's now sold as Tate Lyle Sugars and Syrups in the UK, so you can get it on the shelf, but it's a completely separate company. Tate Lyle, that's hosting this evening, is making functional ingredients, fibres and sweeteners and texturants to make products healthier on the shelf. And you'll find many of our ingredients in your kitchen store cupboard, I'm sure. So I'm going to talk about nutrition. It's a subject that's close to my heart. I've been in it over 30 years now, actually, which always just makes me feel slightly old saying that. But I don't mind, because you're only as old as you feel. I have my degree and PhD from the University of Surrey back in the 90s. And since then, I've worked in big global food companies, as Lillian said. A lot of my roles have been about reformulating foods to make them improved nutritionally, but it's also been about behind the scenes, funding the science that goes behind those products and the communications that we make as the industry to make sure it's upright, honest and true, that products are actually efficacious and do what we claim they do. That's been ranging from whole grain cereals, which I'll talk a little bit about today. More recently, obviously, it's been about fibre, very closely related topics, or it's been simply about how consumers can snack more sensibly. But before I start, I'm going to go on to one open with a question. I would love to open with a question. Thank you. To get you all thinking. Which meal of the day do you find hardest to get right? I don't expect you to shout out the answers. I put this in here because it's such a broad question, and I really know that it will stimulate lots of different thoughts in all of you. For me, actually, I don't even like the question. I don't like the word right. Because what's right for me is not right for any of you in the audience necessarily. We're all different and we all have lots of different nutritional needs. But it also makes us think about what drives our choices, and that's why I've put it in here. Why do I eat what I eat? Is it because it's what my great-grandmother told me to do, as Anthony hinted at earlier? Is it because it's what I need, what I believe in is the right diet for me? Is it because my nutritionist told me to do that? Is it because I'm trying to change? And one of the things we know is change is incredibly difficult. It's so hard to know what to do, and that's why, hopefully, nutritionists can help. nutrition science is the bringing together of so many different sciences. For me, it's a mixture of physiology, it's a mixture of great taste, food science, chemistry, psychology. There are lots of different sciences that come together when we think about nutrition. And put very simply, I always think of nutrition actually as a detective in the food industry. We're trying to find out what happens, and it studies what people eat and what happens when you change what you eat and what the impact is on you and your health. And of course, we know that when we get it out of balance, that starts to cause us concerns. It's such a popular science, everybody has an opinion. And what we face today, of course, is lots of popularist scientific theories and opinions that offer simple solutions to actually incredibly complex topics. And when I talk about all those sciences that go behind the scenes, one of my bugbears is when people say, oh, nutritionists would say that, wouldn't they? And you think, no, actually, there's an awful lot of thought that goes in behind a lot of that. I want to start by a quote as well from the wonderful late Professor Mike Gibney, who many people in this room will remember as a fantastic nutrition scientist and one of the most wonderful people in the way he spoke. He was writing a book when he died a few years ago called In Defense of Bread. And in there, he referred to dissent as the oxygen of science. And it's a quote that I just love because actually dissent and nutrition, I think you can appreciate, go hand in hand. It's one of those where we're always going to have a controversy in nutrition, I think. Traditionally, food hasn't really been designed for a treatment or a cure of a specific disease, but the wonderful progress in science and technology today means that we can evolve foods so that they can really have an impact on our health. And this evening, I want to talk about how science of nutrition can do just that. I think it's not rocket science, and I think many of us in this room will agree that we can make everyday foods healthier. The question is how. And I'm going to focus on three areas this evening, three imperatives, I think, to make that happen, making those foods healthier. The first imperative, I think, is partnership. The second is fortification, and the third is education. And if we start with partnerships, public-private partnerships, not the easiest phrase to say, and I haven't had a glass of wine yet, but it's where all those key stakeholders are acting towards a common goal. Of course, throw in a public face or celebrity, that really helps to get it going as well. But trusted sources all working together towards a common aim, incredibly important. And it's something we started when I was working at Cereal Partners Worldwide, who make Nestlé breakfast cereals. This was back in the early 2000s, where we went on a campaign to increase the whole grain content of all the cereals. And we wanted to do it in a way that it was going to make it easy for consumers. So what we did was we developed a guarantee where we said if you have a portion of cereal, you'll be guaranteed a portion of whole grain. Victoria Target's in the room. She was also influential on this. We also lowered the sugar content in those cereals at the same time. It was a partnership where we were working with the Department of Health. It was the food scientists on the case. And of course, we invested in the human nutrition studies, not only to look at the fibre and the whole grain impact on the taste and the texture of those cereals, but also on the health impacts of whole grains. And we worked with NGOs like the Whole Grains Council at the time to start developing guidelines and logos to help it make it easy for consumers to make the healthier choices. And fortuitously at the time, the Danish Whole Grain Partnership Initiative started back in 2008. This was a national initiative with the ambition of raising the whole grain content in the Danish diet. And it has been heralded as probably one of the most successful global campaigns there has been to improve health. It was a public-private partnership again, and it brought together government, health bodies, health NGOs, health professionals, retailers, food manufacturers. And they had this shared objective of increasing intakes. One of the defining areas or ambitions of the Whole Grain Partnership was that they made everyday foods healthier. So they didn't just try to do it in a few things. There was a lot of foods that were fortified with additional whole grains, or the whole grain level was increased in things like breads, breakfast cereals, pastas, even the famous Danish cinnamon bun. So it was the everyday foods, and that was what was really pivotal, I think, was that it was made easy for consumers, changing those everyday foods. And what they didn't do also was suddenly stick in 10 grams of whole grain. They did it in a gradual way so that they brought consumers with them. And actually, those foods with the higher whole grain content became the norm. They became much more acceptable because of the slow and gradual change. So it was a combination of reformulation, fortification, and then consistent labelling. This logo that you see in the middle, the orange logo, was a logo developed behind which is a set of nutrition profiling. So it's almost a promise to consumers to say, if you choose this, you've got positive nutrition plus the whole grain as well. So it was very carefully regulated in the same way. Impact, incredibly successful. Over the 10, 15 years that this has been in place, the Danish population doubled their whole grain intake. And back about 5 years ago now, it was at 82 grams a day, average adult population intake of whole grains. The target is 90 grams, so they're really close. It's been really successful. Clearly, the Danes were ahead of the curve, and now I'm really pleased that fibre's having its moment. And I would say that, wouldn't I? I'm working for one of the largest fibre providers, but actually, no, I'm a nutritionist at heart, as I said, and when I was doing my undergraduate degree, I remember Friday afternoon lectures sitting looking at Bristol stool charts, which are the pictures of your stools, pre and post fibre. Are you getting enough? Are you getting too much? And believe you me, those photos stay with me. And I have to thank my lecturer on fibre who's sitting in the audience for that photographic memory that I have. But the good news is that fibre today we just know it does so much more than regulate your bowels. And it's a really exciting time for fibre in terms of it feeding the friendly bacteria and having some sort of prebiotic beneficial effects as well. So not only is it feeding our friendly bacteria and altering our gut microbiome, we now know it's leading through to benefits like bone health, cognitive benefits, etc. Now, last year, Food Drink Federation had their Action on Fibre campaign, and sadly, only 7% of the UK population understand how much fibre they should be eating. Along with that depressing statistic is that which came out from the National Diet and Nutrition Survey, showing that only 4% of the UK adult population actually meet their fibre recommendation. There's approximately 100 of us in this room, so only 4 of us are getting enough fibre. Today it's me because I've eaten lots of samples of fibre. But it's not every day. It's actually really hard to do. If we put that in context, actually, last year there was a publication in British Medical Journal that showed approximately 6% of UK adults have got a food allergy of some sort. And if you listen to now the King, when he was Prince Charles, he used to say that 10% of Brits talk to their plants. I'm not quite sure on the statistics around that one, but we know it's a huge concern. And it's not only a concern in the UK, as this graph shows. You know, the big red arrow is showing us that the UK, where our intake is, but where you can see there's a massive gap between most countries, their actual consumption in the blue bars, and where they should be at the top there. So what are we going to do about this? This brings me on nicely to fortification. I love this chart because I just love the picture. You may well have heard about eating a rainbow as one of the pieces of dietary advice from some nutritionists and dietitians. The key point here is that with all of these lovely different coloured foods, you're getting different micronutrients that come associated with those foods. And you may be sitting there thinking, oh, well, she's going to talk about fortification. Shouldn't we all be eating a whole foods diet? The answer is a bit of both, actually. Yes, I'd love us all to be eating a whole foods diet, but it's very difficult to get enough fibre just by eating those whole foods. And so what we've done is some modelling. This is actually a modelling done by somebody in the US, and I'll come on and talk about a UK example in a moment. Slightly complicated chart, so I will just hover. But on the left-hand side, if you think about the strategies of fibre increase, you can either do it through eating more foods, whole foods and fibre-rich foods, or you can do it through fortified foods. On the left-hand side here, if you increase your consumption of fibre-rich foods by approximately 50%, you can up your fibre content in this modelling by 22 grams, which is fantastic, really good impact. Unfortunately, you're quite likely to get another 500 calories because within those foods, you're also eating, of course, sugar, fat, etc., that contribute to calories. The alternative strategy is fibre fortification, where you can actually replace some of the negative nutrients with fibre. So that's one big tick, but you don't have to increase the calorie consumption at the same time. So you get an extra 2.5 grams of fibre per serving in this example, which can lead you up to a 25 gram increase in your fibre intake, but without the concomitant increase in calories. That's just one example. And of course, everything is about balance. It's not going to be easy. But I would say we can fortify foods, and we can fortify everyday foods to make this possible. And the good thing about fibre is that you can fortify without it bringing taste, which you'll be pleased to know brings me to your table. So on your table, you're very welcome to try some of the popcorn if you're so needing and fancy it. Before you try, if anybody's got food allergies, please be aware that there's soy ingredients in the popcorn. This is an example of a fibre fortified popcorn that is currently on the market. And you'll hopefully agree with me that what it does is bring a great fibre hit along with great taste and the benefits of whole grain. Did you know that popcorn's whole grain anyway? It's one of the best snacks around because it is bringing you whole grain, so that's good news. I wasn't paid to say that by anybody. So please enjoy. And while you're enjoying your popcorn, I'm going to come on and talk about a UK modelling study. And I'm going to go quite quickly through this purely because of the interest of time, and I want to give everybody a chance to try some other hands-on science experiments that we've got for you this evening. In this modelling study that Tate Lyle sponsored a few years ago, we actually took the UK National Diet and Nutrition Survey, and 5 classic food groups shown there in the different colour around the circle. The food categories chosen for this fibre fortification study were ones that you were already going to be eating. So again, it's about fortifying everyday foods, make it easy for consumers. And what we did was we didn't touch anything. If there was no fibre in there, we didn't touch the fibre content in the modelling. If there was some fibre, we brought it up to 3 grams per 100 grams, which is the amount necessary to make a claim that it's a source of fibre. So there was a reasonable amount of fibre in there. And if there was already 3 grams of fibre in there, we doubled it up to 6 grams, which is the level with European and UK legislation to make a rich or a high source of fibre. And the results were super dramatic, I have to say. So if we did that, that fibre enrichment would enable 50% more of UK adults to reach the recommended amount of fibre in their diets. There were other positive striking results when we looked at potential impact on non-communicable diseases as well, or weight management. So what I'd like to suggest at the end of this section is really to think about, we need to help consumers by fortifying everyday foods, make it easy for people, make it across the board as well. And in that way, we can make a real difference. And that's what's really driving us as Tate Lyle at the moment. Another example before I go on to education is the hands-on science that you've got on your table. You are very welcome to have a go with me. This is 10 grams of fibre in a sachet here that you've got on your table. And it's incredibly soluble and really doesn't taste and create colour, etc. I don't know whether this is worse than working with animals and children, but I am going to show you live. Simply, you can just put the 10 grams of fibre into your glass of water. If you haven't got a glass of water, I recommend a glass of water. You can do it in wine. I have done it in my glass of wine on a Friday evening. But honestly, do it in your water. It dissolves much better. And you just do need to give it a few moments to dissolve, because what you're going to find is that's going to become incredibly clear. It looks cloudy to begin with. If you think about it, we are currently around 15 grams a day under where we need to be with regards to our fibre intakes. And this is 10 grams that you're doing here. You can do it in a glass of water, as I've just done, but you can also sprinkle it into your bolognese sauce, into your coffee. I actually quite regularly do it in my coffee in the mornings because you just don't know it's there. And I always feel quite virtuous that I've had another 10 grams of fibre. But the point is, we really can't do it alone. So as you're doing this, think about the partnership approach. It's going to take an army to get us to where we need to be. And we look forward to working with many people in the room. It's coming clear. It's like a Guinness, it's coming clear from the bottom. Cheers, Nalani. And finally, I want to finish up with education. So much of the dissent around nutrition stems from misunderstanding, and consumers are getting so many mixed messages, it's hard to get the right messages across. Last year, there was a study published by an Australian group of scientists looking at the quality, the accuracy, and the engagement of nutrition content on TikTok. And the three statistics on the left-hand side there show you how dire it can be. But of course, I'm not picking on this platform. This is just one example. There are many other platforms shown on the right-hand side there where we're trying to get great, credible advice across on social media. I just use this because, of course, social media is actually set up for engagement, not necessarily scientific accuracy. As I bring this session to a close, I really want to thank the museum team for making this evening's event and the role that they are playing in education. They're really trying to make credible, scientifically accurate information get that across to a curious public. The Future of Food exhibition here that Lillian has mentioned, that Tate Lyle is sponsoring, is doing just that. It's really trying to help people understand the role of science and technology, and is responsibly driving evidence-based science education and debate. So I think you said over 200,000 people through the door to date. It's an incredible achievement. And the great achievement is that many of those have been young people, not only their parents and their guardians. So thank you for that. Sat in this iconic institution, and I'll just flick up the mission of the Science Museum again, which I know you've already mentioned. Sat here, stood here, can anybody really be in any doubt of the essential role that science and technology has played to get us where we are today? Anthony's given some fantastic examples. It's really what is going to play into feeding that projected 10 billion people by 2050 sustainably. In a world where 1 in 11 people experience hunger every day, and yet half the population is overweight or obese, it's critically important that we think about this. So at Tate Lyle, our purpose is to transform the lives through the science of food. And we're on a mission to do just that, using the power of our ingredients in everyday foods, as you've heard me say. We call it making tasty food healthier and healthier food tastier. And that's why we believe that Tate Lyle sits right at the centre of the future of food. So what would you like the future of food to be? Thank you for listening.
Huge progress that has been made in reducing malnutrition, reducing famine, reducing diet-related death. Realising how far we've come nutrition-wise and utilising the science, utilising the fortification, the plant-based alternatives is really, really interesting.
The benefits of fibre are generally quite not well understood.
I really realised the importance of it, so I took the freebies with me, started using them. But yeah, we'll definitely be implementing them in my daily routine.
And I think really we need to appreciate how much has been done over many years and decades to get us to this stage, and make sure that we also listen to the voice of science for the future to make the right decisions.
The biggest pressure on the planet comes from the way we produce food and the impacts around that. And I think our happiness, our health is very much related to food and the way we eat it. So really the future of humanity is tied to the future of a sustainable future for food.